which includes around Port Royal and Beaufort. So those of us in this area, we kind of knew from day one about the Emancipation Proclamation and were largely affected by it since then. That became total February 18th, 1865, when a black Union regiment, the Massachusetts 55th, marched through Charleston. The Confederates surrendered and fled, and for about a year and a half, the only white people here were the Unionists for a time, okay? So this was the beginning of Reconstruction period in this area. However, there was still the matter of the rest of the South, okay? So the Confederacy fell April 6, 1865 at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Robert E. Lee surrenders to Grant. 2 days later, Lincoln makes a speech at the White House where he calls for the quote, colored men who, since they have served so valiantly in the war, to be able to have the franchise, as well as for black kids to be able to go to school. Well, there was this guy in the audience who didn't like that. You might have heard of a fellow by the name of John Wilkes Booth. So a few days later, while Lincoln was enjoying a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., Bayow, so much for Lincoln. So therefore, with all of this, the war is pretty much wrapping up, and a Union general named Gordon Granger goes through, is basically taking care of the newly occupied Texas. And while he's doing that, he stops in Galveston, Texas, and he posts an order saying that slavery is ended in this region. By the way, I'm glad you're filming this. If anybody wants to record this, go right ahead, because you're going to hear some stuff tonight that you're not usually going to hear in most of your media outlets in this area. So anyway, he liberates the area. Now, it is often said the African Americans there didn't know that they were free up until that moment. We don't know if that is the case. Some may have known, but one thing we do know is that pretty much ended the last vestiges of slavery that we know of in the United States. 1 year later, a group of black people in Galveston get together at this church, this AME church over there, and they celebrate Jubilee Day, which later became known as Juneteenth after June the 19th, 1865. However, there's another aspect to all of this that coincides. You see, right after all this happens, 1868, over on what is now known as the Julius Wade Worm Judicial Center, then known as the Charleston Clubhouse, as part of Reconstruction, 76 blacks and 48 whites get together to rewrite the Constitution of South Carolina into the most progressive document in American history up to that time. It called for such things as all laws pertaining to racial discrimination be stricken from the books, women would be allowed to divorce abusive husbands, there would be state hospitals and mental institutions, no one would go to jail for debt, and on January 23rd, 1868, the great Robert Smalls, who 6 years earlier sneaked himself and his family aboard a Confederate ship in Charleston Harbor and offered them freedom, he said, resolve all children in South Carolina between the ages of 7 and 14 must attend public school at least 6 months a year under penalty of non-compliance. That was the first public school law passed in the Deep South. While this is happening, in Louisiana, 1872, they impeached a corrupt governor named Henry Warmoth for embezzlement and racketeering and replaced him with the first African-American governor. His name was Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback. And along with this, they passed 3 constitutional amendments to reform the South. The 13th, in 1865, ending slavery throughout the country. The 14th, in 1868, saying all persons born here are citizens. The 15th, in 1870, saying all men born here had the right to vote. So during this time period in South Carolina, from 1870 to 1877, there were 2 black lieutenant governors. Alonzo Jacob Ramsey, 1870 to 1872. Richard Howard Gleaves, 1872 to 1877. Richard Howard Gleaves served under Governor Franklin Jacob Moses. What's the name? Franklin Jacob Moses. First time in American history you have a black lieutenant governor and a Jewish governor. So if everything is going so swimmingly, people usually ask me 2 questions. How come we don't know this, number one? And number two, well, what the heck happened? The answer is very important. You see, throughout the history of the Deep South, the wealthy whites' deepest fear was that the poor whites in their poverty and illiteracy and subjugation would find common cause with their black brethren and come together to create a revolution against the wealthy white planters who exploited them both. So to prevent that from happening, the wealthy class of whites indoctrinated the poor whites into the idea that if black people had equality with them, the poor whites would be pushed to the bottom of society. In simple terms, divide and conquer of the poor so that the rich could stay rich. That's what racism is all about, Charlie.
Wow.
So, on December 24th, 1865, at the courthouse in Pulaski, Tennessee, 6 Confederate veterans came to form the Resistance Army against Reconstruction. They named themselves after the Greek word for circle, which is Ku Klux, and the Scottish word for family, which is clan. You see where that went. So this led to 12 years of massacres and bloodshed throughout the South. One of them culminating on November the 8th, 1876, right over on Broad Street, blacks and whites shotting out in the middle of the street. The Hamburg Massacre of 1876, Ellington, South Carolina Massacre of 1876, Memphis Massacre of 1866, New Orleans Massacre of 1866, etc., and so forth. The federal government said, yo, it's too much. We can't handle this mess. We got to put a stop to this. And they passed the Tilden-Hayes Compromise, February 26, 1877, ending Reconstruction. One of the important byproducts of this is that Mildred Rutherford and her organization, United Daughters of the Confederacy, went on a national crusade to censor things like this out of the history text and replace it with pro-Confederate narratives. So much so that in 1978, when I was in the 8th grade at Mookie Middle School in Mount Pleasant, Blanchard's social studies class, the South Carolina history book, Laidlaw Press, 1970, by Mary Sims Oliphant, taught us on page 280. After the war, the Negroes lost their heads, and the Ku Klux Klan was formed in Tennessee to bring order back to the South. One of the culminating events of this was that in 1895, our senior senator, Benjamin Ryan Tillman, following the leader in Mississippi, who incidentally, 2 years earlier, he sent a black man named John Peterson in Denmark, South Carolina, to a lynch mob. Tillman called the South Carolina legislature together to throw out the Progressive Reconstruction Constitution and replace it with the Segregation Constitution. As described in my 4th book, The 1895 Segregation Fight in South Carolina, 6 brave black leaders, Robert Smalls, who we just discussed, William J. Whipper, a black lawyer on Broad Street, Thomas Miller, the founder of our Black University, South Carolina State, James Wigg and Isaiah Reed, 2 black lawyers from Beaufort, South Carolina, and Robert Anderson, a black teacher from Georgetown. Those 6 brave men risked their lives to go before the South Carolina legislature to argue eloquently against the Segregation Constitution. They lost 116-7, December 4th, 1895, but that loss inspired the next generation to do what they could to overturn those laws. So in the short term, because remember what I'm about to say here, folks, in the short term, they lost the battle, but in the long term, they won the war. They planted the seeds that won the war. And that's important. For in the words of the great philosopher, Jorge Santayana, those who don't remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So they began to celebrate Juneteenth throughout Texas, and in 1990, an African-American Muslim leader by the name of Imam W.D. Muhammad brought the idea to Charleston, and a man named Wally Baya went on to have celebrations here throughout the late 90s and early 2000s, and then Oprah Lee, an advocate from Texas, went to President Biden and signed this into law in 2021. So that's why we're celebrating Juneteenth. But it was important that I tie in with what I just said earlier for you to understand that things that are happening right now did not just happen in a vacuum. They have happened before. We have been here before, and that's why what I do is important, so you will know what happened then, but most importantly, what they did to help stop that from happening later. Thank you.